Well, Lynn has said so much of what I would have said, and as has Chris, but I will say this for a start. I'm sitting here looking at Barbara Hart, and I can say that 15 years ago when we went to conferences, a few of us who were concerned about violence against women, and Bernie was with us, and Angela and some others, and we would try to stir up a lot of interest in the research community about violence against women. And we weren't looking out at rooms this large, and I am so grateful to all of you who've come and who've paid attention over the years and who've committed yourselves and your passion to doing this work side by side, the advocates and the practitioners in the field. It has made such a difference, and that has been one of the true impacts of the Violence Against Women Act, so thank you. As Chris said, and as Lynn said, I think the coordinated community response is really more about, I think, the incredible success that advocates in this country have had in raising our awareness and our understanding about the dynamics of sexual and domestic violence and its impact on our culture. When we talk about bringing people to the table, that was not an easy thing. And I was there at those beginning conversations. What made the difference was that you had police, prosecutors, judges, and other criminal justice officials in large numbers sitting at a table with perhaps one or maybe at the most two advocates. But their voices were heard loud, and they were heard strong, and they were tenacious, and they kept at it. And sooner rather than later, what really made a difference and what created an impact was that law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, and others in the system, probation officers, joined ranks with the advocates, and they started to place themselves in the skin of women like the women Paula described in her remarks. They started to understand what it was like to live in fear, and they started to understand why victims didn't always present so well in court, and they changed, and that shift continues. We learned that judicial response matters, we learned that arrest matters, but we also learned that race matters. And one of the unintended consequences of the VAWA, unfortunately, that I also came to understand quite directly, is that just like in every other part of the work we do in criminal justice, we were arresting men of color disproportionately. And that is something that I think has been, as I said, an unintended consequence of the VAWA and something that we need to take very much care of in the future. Women of color and men of color who do this work also challenged us to understand that the impact of the VAWA wasn't the same for everybody, that access to justice and access to services is different if you are a woman of color, and arrest and the way you are treated is different if you are a man of color. So we have started in recent years, I think, to begin to engage in an honest conversation that access to justice and services is different and must come through community-defined solutions that are not cookie cutters for every community. The immigration provisions of the VAWA in 2000 provided access to services and especially legal advocacy to women who ordinarily would never have received it and may have found themselves back home in another country only to be perceived by their family as having left their children unintentionally and they went back to more violent situations than they came from. The other thing that the VAWA did in recent years, and it's been touched on, is the enormous amount of work that's been done in tribal and Native communities. And that cannot be, the way that VAWA has addressed sexual violence has been extraordinary. I want to touch on one other unintended consequence, and that is that I believe since the VAWA has, since we've worked and lived with the VAWA all these years, women are losing custody of their children. Women of color are losing custody of the child protection system, and white women are losing custody through the courts to their abusers. And that's something that we also need, as we will talk further, to begin to address. But I think that has been an unintended consequence. Finally, I think as we become more sophisticated about the impact of sexual and domestic violence in this country, we really do understand that trauma is at the root of so much of our work. And before she died, Susan Schechter did some terrific work in this field, and I wanted to name her and acknowledge that today and say that I think that that is something that as we move forward, particularly as we look at the Attorney General's initiative on children exposed to violence, we will really be paying close attention to the impact of trauma and what successful interventions help to make life for children and their non-abusing parent whole again. And then finally, I also do want to add that I think we were very successful in the early days in addressing domestic violence, but I think that we had a lot of catching up to do and still do to address sexual violence. Thank heaven for the Sexual Assault Services Act and the Sexual Assault Services Program, and part of that $730 million that Lynn mentioned includes $30 million for direct services for sexual assault services, and we can't ever forget that rape victims are also part of this equation. So those are my few